And welcome back. So South Africa has taken over the G20 presidency, the first African country to lead the forum. The G20 is a forum of the largest economies in the world, including China, France, Germany, India, the UK, as well as the United States. South Africa was the only African member until the addition of the African Union in 2023. President Cyril Ramaphosa has cited inclusive economic growth, food security, climate change and artificial intelligence as priorities. To talk to us about the significance of the presidency, we are now joined by the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. So it is official. South Africa is now officially taken over the presidency of the G20. Speak to us about the significance of this as South Africa takes over, of course, coming out of the G20 that was held in Brazil.
Great. Good morning, Aldrin. So it is very significant. You've already identified that this is the first time South Africa and an African country is indeed chairing the G20. And that means that as the G20 chair, you're in a position to put onto the agenda issues that are important to you as a country, but also in the case of South Africa for the continent. We saw that being done during the Brazilian presidency with the priorities that President Lula had identified, which focused on inequality, hunger and poverty, critical issues that are equally important for South Africa and Africa. And so South Africa is using this as an opportunity to put onto the agenda or to build on previous agendas issues around development and social concerns. The last 3 years have seen 3 developing country presidencies in the G20: Indonesia, India, and Brazil, and now South Africa. And all of those, and I think South Africa will simply take this forward and build on it, have really emphasized that the G20 should be ultimately about ensuring development and socioeconomic concerns are front and center. And when we think about issues, for example, like international financial architecture, it is ultimately about how that architecture helps to advance our development and social priorities.
Yeah, I see the business days also running with an advisory that there will be a so-called B20. What happens in a B20?
So the B20 is one of, I think, 12 or 13 engagement groups that have emerged over the course of the G20. These are engagement groups that focus on specific sectors. So the B20 is the Business 20. Which is, the businesses in the various G20 members coming together to discuss and focus on, and often they produce papers and recommendations on issues, for example, like ESG, environmental, social, governance factors when it comes to operating an environment. They might focus on issues related to the energy transition. But it is one of those engagement groups. The other one, of course, is the Think 20, which SAIA is involved in. And that's the think tanks from the G20 members who are supposed to be the think bank, I suppose, of the G20, focusing on issues, making recommendations, policy recommendations to the G20 grouping on issues on the agenda and also potentially issues over the horizon. There's also a Labour 20, a Youth 20, a Civil 20, and a few others that all meet during the course of the year and engage with the official government track as well.
Yeah, one of the points that have been stressed about the G20 is that you have the rotational presidency and the chairmanship of the G20, which comes after every year. And the argument that has been put forward that a year is not enough to implement some of the proposals that you have. For instance, if we look at what happened in Brazil and what will now be rolling over with the South African presidency as well. For me, it's the issue around how do you make sure that some of the decisions that come out of the G20 are of such significance that they're actually able to shift the needle?
I think it's a very important point, and implementation is always a challenge. It is even more of a challenge when you're dealing with an informal grouping, because at the end of the day, the G20 is an informal grouping. It doesn't have a formal secretariat. It's not like any of the big formal multilateral organizations. And it is like that for a reason, because at the end of the day, the G20 as you said at the beginning, is a group of the most systemically important countries in the world. They're able to push things. If they arrive at a consensus on a particular issue, they're able to push things in the more formal spaces like the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, the WTO, or the various COPs. What is useful, though, to remember is that you can certainly build a platform that subsequent presidencies actually are compelled to take forward. Now, clearly, they may be more enthusiastic or less enthusiastic about some of these things. But the fact that if you can get them into the leaders' declaration, if you, for example, can commission, like the Brazilians and the Indians before them have done, an expert's report on the World Bank or on something related to just energy transitions, etc., and it forms part of the G20 outcomes, the subsequent presidencies do take it forward. As I said, it may vary in terms of acceleration, but they do take it forward. The other way of ensuring some degree of implementation relates to something that the Brazilians did this year, which is launch the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. Yeah. Now, what that does is it creates a secretariat. It almost moves out of the G20 space and develops a life of its own. And now, there's a secretariat being set up in Washington, D.C., another one in Rome. And there are also financing instruments that have been proposed that enable it then to become almost a self-functioning, autonomous initiative that came out of the G20, but now is running, will be running, on its own steam.
Yeah, one of the other aspects in terms of what South Africa wants to achieve is the strengthening of the WTO. And you did just mention the WTO now. And we know that Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has now been re-elected as the Director General. But a point that was stressed before was that with the re-election of Donald Trump, she's up for a fresh fight again. With the Donald Trump administration. And I wonder what impact that would have on this initiative by South Africa to strengthen the WTO and what the strengthening of the WTO looks like when the biggest economy in the world is being led by a person like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important thing, and it's a question, and it's not just related to the WTO. I think the first point to note is that after South Africa's presidency, the presidency moves to the US. So the US will be part of the Troika, which is the current presidency of the G20, the previous one, which is Brazil, and then the future one, which is the US. So that will create a number of challenges which will have to be navigated carefully. I mean, that's the first general observation to make. The second one, of course, relates specifically to your point about the WTO. South Africa has identified a couple of areas where it would want to see some progress. The first relates, of course, to the dispute settlement mechanism, which has pretty much been paralyzed for several years, even going back to the Obama administration, because the US won't enable the appointment of additional judges to ensure there is a quorum. That is not, it's unlikely to be resolved. Let me be diplomatic. It's unlikely to be resolved in the course of the next year because of the issues you've outlined in the US. The second area that South Africa has identified relates to really looking at the WTO's trade framework and saying we've got to make it much more focused and responsive to the challenges of climate and development. And there again, I think it will certainly be quite a challenge, not just because of a new US administration, but I think more generally because the climate globally in a number of countries, some of them even in the global south, doesn't necessarily see the issue of trade through that prism. I think South Africa. That doesn't mean that because it's going to be difficult, South Africa shouldn't put it onto the agenda. But I think we probably need to be quite modest about what we can get out of it. I mean, more generally on trade, we see the world fragmenting pretty much because of paralysis in the WTO more generally. And that certainly is a concern for economies like South Africa's and others that, trade very much with the world and very, very much part of global supply chains. And that will, I think, be one of the issues where we have to probably put it on the agenda, but be modest about what we can expect.
Sure, Dr. Anthea, just quickly, I want to squeeze in this question. So you have the G20 report from the WTO that was handed over, speaking about trade restrictive measures that were introduced by G20 economies and the significant impact of that. That X from Donald Trump about BRICS member states introducing a currency to compete against the wonderful dollar, as he puts it. He says that they would need to go and find other suckers if they were to be implementing any decision like that. What does that then do to how we understand trade amongst the various countries, but also the possibility of escalating a trade war?
Well, this is the big question with the Donald Trump administration. The fact that, he said, what did he say? His favorite word is tariffs, and he's already threatened his closest neighbors and important trading partners, Canada and Mexico. We know his views on China as well. And this speaks to the fracturing of a much more open trade system. But the fact remains, and I think you've picked on it, that over the last several years, the G20 countries themselves have introduced all sorts of protectionist measures, which the WTO religiously documents, notwithstanding the fact that within the G20 they have made commitments in the Leaders' Declaration in the Trade and Investment Working Group to reduce the number of protectionist members, to ensure that the global economy remains open for trade and so on and so forth. And this is unfortunately part of this trajectory that we've seen, which is responsive to the populist pressures that many societies are experiencing because of the sense that globalization at the end of the day has actually not benefited them. And they see that, they see the tool, the instrument to respond to that in terms of those who have been left behind as closing borders, trying to bring jobs back to those countries. We know there were good reasons why they left in terms of costs and so on. Or in a geopolitical context to reorient trade to friends. And there was also an UNCTAD report that highlighted that was also a development that was happening in the trade environment.